Hello, and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, coming at you on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and here on YouTube with video for those of you who like to watch and not just listen. This week, I have a special guest on, and we are going to talk about sexual abuse in destructive cults. We're going to talk about this is really a bit of a hot topic right now. With the things, the revelations that are coming out about sexual abuse and harassment that's been occurring as a standard practice just about in the entertainment industry and in the government. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of that. But what also needs to be talked about and highlighted is the sexual abuse that occurs within these destructive cults. And that very much includes Scientology. And what I'm going to talk about with my guest here, though, today is how that is playing out and coming into the forefront in the media these days with the Latter-day Saints, with the Mormons. And so, Jonathan Streeter, welcome to the show.
It's great to be back, Chris.
Yes, wonderful having you back on. You're my go-to guy on this topic. And actually, I had a reader suggest a viewer suggest to me that I take this subject matter on, and and referenced a blog out there that's talking about this. I asked you about it. You were familiar with that. And so we decided to jump into this because it's, like I said, it's a bit of a hot topic, and it's also, beyond any headlines, it's also just a very important thing to be exposing about what goes on. So why don't we just dive right in, and you tell me what is happening right now in the Mormon community with this.
So I think we're in a special national moment right now, and it all really started with the Harvey Weinstein scandal, where all of these women have come forward and said, yeah, I was subject to harassment, abuse. I think in some cases, what is rape, if not tantamount to rape, because and I subjected myself to this because there was such a disparity in power. He was this producer. He was basically in control of my career. And so he had this hold over me. And now we feel like we can speak out about it and be believed. Whereas before, if you speak out about it, your career is going to be ruined, or people would be less inclined to believe you. And I think this may even reach back further to the election of Donald Trump, where suddenly we're having to reflect on what is our character as a nation. Are we going to have somebody who, is an admitted sexual harasser who talks about things like grabbing women by the genitalia, treating them as objects? And I think we've had now a few months of reflection. Now that's coming out in being able to speak truth to power to Harvey Weinstein. And then we've got all of these other large figures where suddenly people who lived in an environment where they could act with impunity because of that power and their position are finding an accounting happening because victims are being brave enough to speak out. And the public has now a mindset where they understand and validate the concerns of the victims, and they're starting to believe the victims. And I think the courage is contagious in this regard, where more and more people are being willing to speak out. And as you said, we're reevaluating how we look at these foci of power, whether it's through popularity or economic or other power, and religion is a huge component of that. Certainly we had the Catholic Church with the Spotlight movie and the revelations about their cover-up of abuses. It's caused them to have to change policies even down to the local level, even though it was the higher-ups that did the cover-up. And those policies were geared now towards protecting the vulnerable people that are in the charge of these priests. Well, other religions should take note at the consequences the Catholic Church had to pay, both financially, institutionally, as well as in the hearts and minds of people who previously revered them, and should be looking to proactively examine their own policies and see if there are any potential problems that they need to correct. And in Mormonism, this is taking the shape not of the institution itself doing it from within, but rather from even faithful members of the church looking back and realizing there's a problem and speaking out about it. And I think in Mormonism, we're starting to see a moment where people are starting to feel more comfortable speaking truth to power, so to speak, in a way they never had before, where they can say, these policies that have been instituted by history, by leaders in the past, are wrong. They've led to abuse. not only have they led to abuse, but they've also distorted and caused a great deal of harm of individual members on issues of sexuality. And all of this is being really brought to the forefront by one former Mormon bishop from Houston, Texas. His name is Sam Young. And he's somebody who was, as I said, in the 90s, he was a bishop. He's been assigned by church leaders to be outreach from Mormonism to the local Baptist congregation. He's really been, somebody who was considered faithful enough and strong and stalwart enough that he could branch out and try to find where Mormonism intersects with other faiths and kind of normalize Mormonism. Well, as he's done that, he's also spoken to people who've left the church. He's listened to their concerns, and he's found that there are some legitimate concerns of former Mormons dealing with the history of the church, but as well as the current policies. And one of these that really affected him personally was the issue of how bishops, now again, a bishop in Mormonism is the main leader of a single local congregation. So how the bishops interact with children, young adults, and even adults in closed door one-on-one sessions that take the form of worthiness interviews. And I think this is where we're going to see some parallels perhaps with what you have in Scientology with what Mormonism has. But to give you some background, in Mormonism, there is a culture and tradition where as you turn 8 years old and you become baptized, you become a formal member of the church, and you're given the idea that you now have the maturity to know right from wrong. When you undergo a serious sin, the way to absolve yourself or to get forgiveness of that sin is to go through a repentance process. And one of the steps of that process for serious sins is to confess to your bishop. And the bishop is the priesthood leader who is given the special authority to manage that confession. He acts in basically sitting in the place of the Savior of Christ, listening to the confession. He's believed to have a special spirit of discernment, so he can know if someone's telling the truth or not. It's his duty to pull the truth out of you. If he senses you're not being truthful enough, he will ask more questions. And he's been taught through lectures from higher up church leaders that he needs to know the full extent of the sin in order to determine the full extent of the repentance. And so what, I've just described in kind of bland terms what happens, but then when the rubber hits the road, when you're a 14-year-old boy or girl and you're sitting in the chair in front of the bishop, what that may take the form of is, so when is the last time that you masturbated? Mm-hmm. So you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Does he touch you? Where does he touch you? Do you orgasm? How many times does this happen? And this, when you hear me say these things and you imagine a 50-year-old accountant who was called to be the bishop, because remember, Mormons have a lay clergy, just imagine them sitting in a closed door, no parents are around, asking these questions. Now, this was what I experienced growing up. I had a bishop ask me about masturbation when I didn't even know what that was. And when Sam first posted his question, is this happening in other people? He was confused because he himself did not have this experience growing up. He didn't have a bishop ask him personal questions of a probing sexual nature when he grew up. And so when he himself was a bishop, he didn't ask those questions. But he heard a friend say, Sam, one of the reasons I left the church was that I was sitting outside the door when my son went in for his bishop's interview. And he came out quickly in the middle of the interview when his face was pale white. And he said, Dad, the bishop asked me if I masturbate and if I had ever had sex with another boy. And he was furious. He stepped into the room and he told the bishop, if you ever ask any question like that of my son again, I'm going to floor you. And when the guy told that to Sam, he's like, I've never heard anything like, why would a bishop do this? And so then later he asked his daughter, has a bishop ever talked to you about masturbation in your worthiness interviews? And she's like, oh yeah, that started at 12 when I was 12, and pretty much through my entire youth, every time I went in, they asked me if I masturbated. And he's like, he had no idea that this was part of the common culture of Mormonism.
Wow.
He knew it was wrong. Yeah, he knew it was wrong.
Well,
So what he did is he started a petition saying, this is wrong. We just need the church to clarify and to stop this practice and explicitly stop it. And it has snowballed from there. So I've taken now kind of a long time to describe where we are at this point. There's a few things that have happened, but I'm interested now that you kind of see that to get your take on, does Scientology have a similar problem, or is there
without
stuff that goes
question.
on?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I will get to that, but I first wanted to comment on the fact that something I noticed right away getting into this story and looking at the media on it is the defenders of this practice, and Sam, to his credit, and I have to say I am impressed by this man because of the not only the fact that he questioned what was going on and looked further, but he then took proactive measures to do this petition. I didn't realize he was the one who was doing that. Yeah. I'd seen the story about the petition. But the defenders of this, from what I've seen, and I haven't seen lots of it, I haven't been on the Facebook groups or anything, but I see a sort of, well, if it didn't happen to me, I can't believe that actually happens. And I just want to note that this is all too common with us, this sort of, I never saw it, I never heard it, and therefore it must not be true. We really got to get over ourselves with that sort of view, because that is a way of becoming a kind of enabler for sexual violations. That just because you're being purposefully ignorant, didn't happen to me, so it must not happen.
Exactly. I've read some of those defenses, and I think your take on it, alludes to some of the root problem of it. You and I, we talk a lot about cult indoctrination. We talk about, thought reform, and what we're seeing here ties back to that. And that is, when you are working with organizations that have a notion of sacred science and doctrine over self, then when it comes to criticizing the leaders, you can't do that. And so what you have to do when you're faced with someone who's raising a criticism, whether it's legitimate or not, is defend it. And you're going to always be able to defend policies like this with religious words that sound nice. Oh, well, these are sacred interviews, and they're really geared at helping members really work through their own problems. We were concerned about individual development and chastity and all of these things. But the thing is, using the language of piety and the language of religion to put a sickly sweet veneer over outright abuse is just the stock and trade of predators who use religious means to get to there. And so the question is not, we're not trying to say that every bishop is a predator. What we're trying to say is that because you can't tell the difference between a predator and a non-predator, and because bishops are not perfect, and the church even admits, nobody, even the prophet and the apostles, are immune from temptation and may be subject to temptation. We had a recent high leader that was excommunicated, and which means he did something that was worthy of that. Well, since those things are true, we have to have policies which protect vulnerable members in positions that could be exploited for abuse. And I think it's a no-brainer. Like if I was to describe, okay, let's say that you've got Billy and he's in the park, and a guy dressed kind of, like a hobo walks up and says, Billy, come here and sit next to me. Now, Billy, when's the last time you touched yourself? And did you orgasm, Billy? And were you looking at porn? What kind of porn were you looking at, Billy? Like you would say that, you'd be like, no, that is totally inappropriate. Okay,
That's
well, let's change it up now. Let's have, instead of being dressed like a hobo, he's wearing a business suit. Billy, come here. Okay, Billy, tell me the last time you touched yourself. It's highly inappropriate. Okay, well, now let's move it from the park into a religious building, into a church building, and put it behind a closed door where nobody can see. Billy, tell me the last time you touched yourself, Billy. I'm only here to help you, Billy.
Exactly.
And, it doesn't matter. It almost gets even creepier the more you do that, because when you start adding religion and God into the mix, it gives these men who sit in positions of power even greater authority that young children who are as young as 8, 12, 14 years old, they don't have the ability or the experience to know how to defend themselves in those situations.
That's right.
And so what happened is he posted this petition and said, if you support the idea, we're not trying to criticize the church. We're not trying to prove it's wrong. All we're saying is that we are better than this. We can come up with policies that are protective and still safeguard and, look after the flock, so to speak. So he said, if you support this, sign it. You can sign it anonymously. And if you have any personal experience, feel free to put that in the memo. And so we've now got over 8,000 signatures of people, many of whom are members of the church, many of whom are former members of the church, and many of whom are people from other denominations or atheists who see the danger of this policy and want to see a change for it. And those stories are heartbreaking. We've had stories of abuse, which included, these confession interviews being used for grooming for subsequent abuse that took place. In some cases, we have the fact that you've normalized now sexual conversation between somebody in a position of power and a young child, then it put them in a position where even though the bishop himself was not a predator, in the future when some other priesthood holder or a family member broached those subjects, then the children didn't understand that those were inappropriate boundaries.
Right.
And so this sort of thing, just on the abuse side of thing, really pervades everything, but indoctrinated people feel compelled to defend it. It can't be wrong. And you're going to always be able to find nice, flowery language to defend these things. And it holds no water. It just reveals that the people doing that don't understand the nature of abuse. They don't understand how the authority can get abused, and they aren't putting thought into it. And we're hoping that this process is going to educate people so that they'll change their position in that regard.
Well, this is definitely the right way to go about it, because you have a member of the church doing this, and that is again. I mean, I'm impressed. I'm surprised, and I'm impressed.
Well, he's gotten some personal attacks against him because he's been vocal about, even before this issue landed on his plate, he has been vocal about his concerns over other issues of church history. And the thing is, this subject of people in authority exploiting people under them for sexual gratification goes all the way back to the origin of Mormonism, because Joseph Smith himself took on multiple wives without his first wife's knowledge. And that included a sexual dimension. And it was always done with this idea that he was a man of God. He had been given special permission from God, and he had elevated and restored this new concept of marriage, which included plural marriage. That was a beautiful, glorious thing. And the leaders subsequent to that, expanded on it even further, where you have, men in their 50s marrying teenagers. And, these were prophets of God. And if they're prophets of God, you can't question them. And so this is tied intimately with the history of Mormonism, because if we had a Joseph Smith today in the environment of Harvey Weinstein and people being aware of abuses of power, I don't think it would have ever taken off. There would have been too much of an outcry. But we as a society have kind of moved on, and we've become a little bit more enlightened about this issue. Certainly there's still going to be problems, but this is how you move through them, as you have moments like this, like we're experiencing.
Absolutely. And of course the real the offshoots of Mormonism, the FLDS, are just horrifying with this.
Absolutely.
Right? And I'm not going to lay blame for that at the feet of the modern Mormon church, because I understand that is an offshoot, and it is an extremist group that I don't think many Mormons even particularly. I have it right that Mormons don't endorse what the FLDS is doing?
No, absolutely not. I think if you describe what Warren Jeffs and the FLDS movement did, he has his victims now speaking out about how he was a pedophile, and he, as the leader of one of their schools, sexually abused boys and girls. And then when he took the mantle of the prophet, he exploited that position and was a predator absolutely in that regard. And so now his butt is in jail, but he's still the leader. The people that are indoctrinated are still defending Warren Jeffs, and that the mechanism behind that, the psychological mechanism behind that, is the same thing that we're facing in Mormonism when people defend these policies. Because there is no defense for this policy. And I think in Sam's petition and interviews about him, he took a day and protested in front of the main temple in Salt Lake City.
I think I saw the video of that.
Yeah, and got local news coverage. And now we're starting to see that pick up national news coverage. And that's where we have the Huffington Post writing about it, Raw Stories written about it. The thing is, this thing is so obviously dangerous and hurtful to anyone outside of Mormonism that it is, and the fact that it's getting this national stage, if you're being approached by Mormon missionaries, this better be one of your questions. If I join your church and my kid is being raised, is your leader going to start probing him about masturbation without me being there? How is that appropriate? And so it's going to change eventually. It's just, are they going to realize that they're shooting themselves in the foot by continuing to put children in the position of danger and continuing to give, it's one thing. We talk about how these are bishops with no training and no accountability that are having these conversations. And my fear is that because that's how we're framing it in some cases, that the church is going to say, well, why don't we just train them? We'll train them and we'll give them, parameters. And that sounds good. But the problem is you can give them training, but this is a man of God who's, being told that he's a man of God. The people believe he's a man of God. And you can give him whatever training. And, I'm sure Catholic bishops got all kinds of training, but people who exploit those positions of power for the purposes of abuse, they're not going to say, oh, well, I went through training, I guess I better not abuse these kids. That doesn't work. And on top of that, there is damage beyond abuse that happens because of these interviews. And, that speaks to, in Mormonism, we have this thing called the law of chastity. And when you go through the temple, one of the solemn covenants you make is that you're going to obey the law of chastity. And it's defined as no sexual relations except between a legally and lawfully married husband and wife.
Oh,
number one, that's a farce because Joseph Smith was not legally and lawfully married to his multiple wives. All of those marriages were illegal. And so he would be, excommunicated if he did what he did today. But that's an aside. The other thing is that we consider masturbation to be within the framework of that law of chastity. It's a sexual sin. And so, when I grew up, I had videos, I had leaders, I have church manuals, condemning masturbation, saying that it is a violation of the law of chastity. And when you read the Book of Mormon, there's a section in it where the prophet says that violation of sexual sin, breaking the law of chastity, is the sin next to murder. And so
I saw that and I just about fell out of my chair.
Yeah.
Talk about a false equivalency.
Oh, absolutely. How do you have any moral compass if you're putting sexual sin like masturbation on the same footing or just a hair below murder?
Right.
But you've got all these teenagers now that are at the peak. So I've done a paper on this that you can find where you look medical research, and testosterone is one of the primary determinants of libido. Mm-hmm. And if you map out over an individual's life, their average blood testosterone level at the teenage years, it is higher, teenage and early 20s, higher than it will ever be, which means that they have the highest sex drive. And in Mormonism, that's accompanied by the time where they have no normal sexual outlet. They cannot have sex with their girlfriend. The only sexual outlet that people in that position usually have is masturbation. What you've got is a culture where every teenager succumbs to masturbation because it's a normal part of human sexual development, and they feel completely worthless and debased because they violated this sacred law of chastity, and they look around and they assume everybody else is abstaining from it, and so they go through cycles of guilt and shame, and it compounds and makes the matter worse. And so then some of them will say, well, I'm this worthless human being. They'll go to a conference, they'll listen to a talk where they say, see the bishop. If you've struggled with this issue, see the bishop and he'll help you get through these difficult times. And so they go to the bishop and they say, and the bishop will say, well, do you keep the law of chastity? And they'll say, no, bishop. And this is where I think some of the defenders are playing with words. So if you go and you look at the comments on the petition, people will say, I never had a bishop ask me inappropriate questions. All they did was ask me if I kept the law of chastity. And if you believe that you're going to answer yes to that, then that's a very short interview. Do you keep the law of chastity? Yes, Bishop, I do. Okay.
Right.
And most people lie about it. They're like, oh, I'm not going to talk to the bishop because I'm so ashamed. But as soon as somebody tells the truth, do you keep the law of chastity, Billy? Well, I've broken the law of chastity. Oh, really? How did you break the law of chastity? Well, I masturbated. How did you masturbate? And the questions then start from there. And it sounds weird when you have an older man talking about it with a younger man, but this also happens with girls. So you'll have a 56-year-old man talking with, a young teenager, an older
Yeah, he could be talking
teenager.
to a 13-year-old.
Right. And even beyond that, he could be talking to a 25-year-old who hasn't been married yet, and
Right.
they're treated like children. And it's incumbent upon him then to ask questions about that. And the depth of that probing is so inappropriate. It is scarring. When you listen to people who have written, if you go through and read the comments on the petition, people will tell you how they felt after this type of interview. They felt violated. Not only did they feel violated, but they also themselves felt dirty and worthless. And this followed them. And many of them said, I confessed that first time, and the psychological scarring was so deep, I never confessed again. I just left the church. I didn't want to have to deal with that.
Wow.
And this is because, the church was so intense on its teaching on masturbation. We have a group called Mormon Leaks that leaks out internal documents in the church. And one of the things they recently leaked was a manual that was given to bishops in the 80s that talked about homosexuality. And at that time, they were teaching that it was a choice. And if you read through the manual, there's a section on masturbation. And it says that homosexuality is one thing that results from masturbation. And then it makes this like a point, because masturbation is almost ubiquitous in the homosexual community. And this is
ubiquitous in every community. What
exactly,
are you talking about?
This is how clueless they are about normal human sexual development. And yeah, they're the ones who are standing as judges and condemning entire groups of people. This was at a time when there was things like electroshock therapy trying to deconvert gay people. But when you look at that section in the manual on homosexuality, it talks about how bishops should interview youth. And so this is before the bishop even knows that they're dealing with a gay youth. And it says the type of questions that you need to ask about masturbation are very deep and very probing. And
wow.
it actually gives you the bishop some examples. So anyone out there that says the bishops have never been instructed to ask these type of questions are flat out wrong. They've been given very explicit instructions. And frankly, because of this leak website, Mormon Leaks, we have the hard copy of what the bishops were told. It's not only a focus for abuse, as we talked about at the beginning, it also distorts human sexuality and imbues this notion of self-loathing on the part of all of the people who are subjected to this type of teaching about masturbation, because it demonizes a normal part of human sexual development. There's another aspect of this that people don't think about that much, which is that men feel self-loathing because they don't abstain from it. The testosterone is so high, it drives them. But women, what it does is it gives them this notion that they're dirty down there. And the prohibition on touching themselves disrupts their normal human sexual development, because the primary determinant of female orgasm is clitoral stimulation, both when you're with an intimate partner as well as when you're with yourself. And so if they have psychologically blocked any touching of the clitoris, then, we have stories now of people who've gotten out of Mormonism and learned normal human sexual development, and they realized that because they were denied the primary driver of the female orgasm, they lived decades of their life rarely, if ever, having actually experienced orgasm, because human sexuality was only about the male ejaculation.
Exactly. And that's a problem across religions, because that goes across the boards, right? Because women have just been treated like cattle and second-class citizens in so many ways. And that point you just made is only very recently coming out as like hey, we are really messing up these women. Yeah. These young girls, really. Because that's where the messing up starts. And then you have a lifetime of women feeling inadequate, feeling like there's something wrong with them. and movies being, you know, showing something completely opposite to what happens in reality. And so they feel they're not living up to that standard. And so there's no way that you can look at the entire structure of what we're doing to girls, who become women, and think that that is healthy in any way. And you add this religious component to it, and it just makes it 10 times worse because of all of the guilt and the sin and this is all such a horrible thing, when it's, no, man, it's just how we biologically are.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know?
And I think, so we've talked about the different facets of it, the abuse, distortion of normal human sexuality and the resulting self-loathing and all the negative stuff there.
Yeah.
You know, other people are waking up to this. So what happened just in the last couple of days is the SNAP group, which is a network of people who have survived abuse by Catholic priests. They were the group that was instrumental in what you saw depicted in the Spotlight movie in Boston. They actually made a blog post or a statement on it supporting this petition, saying, you know, it's very clear that if the policies that the institution has now are an invitation for abuse, because they basically, you know, craft this precise type of unaccountable imbalance of power that was exploited in the Catholic priests. And they're just like, this is, you know, it's going to set up abuse. And we fully support the petition that it's happening there. And we're hoping that people become educated on this process. Well, interestingly, the official church newspaper for the Mormon Church, it's called the Deseret News, just today issued an editorial where they hit back on that, and they say, no, this is not an invitation for abuse. You know, any religious organization has the responsibility to look to the moral character development of their members, and in Mormonism that includes these very sacred interviews that priesthood leaders who have a mantle of authority conduct with people who, you know, feel a need to confess sin. And so I think this battle of ideas is playing out on a very national stage. The more that the church makes these entrenched statements, the harder it is going to be for them to change. Because if they change, it admits that they were wrong. And so I think, you know, we saw this, I think, with the race issue. You know, the more solid statements you have them digging in their heels, in their outdated ways of thinking, it becomes harder for them to change. But we're in a world now where things happen a lot faster with the internet. So I'm hopeful that, you know, we're starting to see family members in the church, active members, go to the bishop and say, you will not ask my child or talk to my child about any sexual issues without me present in the room.
Excellent.
And that type of pushback on the authority of the leaders is becoming more commonplace. And I think you can do it without even it being confrontational. You know, I don't attend anymore, but my kids sometimes go with their mother. And I made it a point to attend one day and took the bishop to the side. And I said, I just want you to know that in no way will you ever have my consent to have a private one-on-one interview with my children. And he was like, I appreciate that. Thanks for letting me know. And I've had a follow-up conversation with him since this petition has come to light, and he just reaffirmed, you know, I'm going to respect your wishes. And so he's a good guy. I think that he's misguided in the type of boundary crossing that he's given permission to indulge in people in his life, but he's respecting my wishes as a parent. And so I'm hopeful that a lot of bishops will do that. But I will tell you, if you go to my YouTube channel, there's one video that's a secretly recorded conversation between a bishop and a parent. And the parent was saying, I think it's inappropriate of you talking about masturbation to my 8-year-old. And it's about an hour-long video, and the bishop is absolutely defending his position, saying it's right, and criticizing the dad for even raising the question. And so that is, I think the video, if you Google father of the ward, father of the child,
we'll get that we'll get that in the show notes for sure.
Yeah.
This is a really touchy subject. There is this old ingrained idea in our culture from Catholicism, from Christianity, from Mormonism, of confession. And confession's good for the soul. Confession is necessary. Confession is a rite of like RITE, like it's a rite that is necessary in a religion. Scientology glommed onto this right away. In the early 1960s, Hubbard glommed onto this. And I'm just going to say straight up that I disagree with the entire concept of it. What I mean by that is making it into a ritual, making it into a guilt process, making it into a procedure of control, where the church is now going to control your morality and control your life through these more moral, guidelines. That if you break these moral guidelines, if you break these rules, you must tell us all about it. Yeah. And if you don't, that itself is a sin, and that itself endangers your ability to get whatever the good is, the carrot is, right, that the religion offers. This is a control mechanism straight up. And I think that
absolutely,
you've definitely given a great analogy as to the inappropriateness of questioning children about this when you make the comparison to a hobo or a businessman, out on the street. What's the difference? Well, the difference is this is a holy man. Well, in Mormonism, it's not. It's a bishop's just a regular guy.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about some cardinal in the Catholic Church who's gone to seminary and gone to this and that. But even people who have gone to seminary, even people who have gone to, and I might be using the wrong words. I'm not educated on this stuff enough I'm just going to throw some of this stuff out here, but an educated, degreed,
professional clergyman.
Catholic priest. We already know what they are capable of. They're human beings first. And they're just as capable of sin, and to the Catholic Church's shame, and what should be to the Mormon Church's shame, and any group that engages in this practice. They attempted, their first impulse was to cover it up when abuses came to light, as though that was somehow going to protect the sanctity of the church, which is nothing but flat out hypocrisy. And Absolutely. Then they wonder why people get so pissed at them and why religious membership is on the decline. Well, it's a problem of your own making, guys, because you've proven historically, over and over and over again, that you can't be trusted. Because when tested on that trust, like you're given a great deal of trust. You are entrusted with a child or with a parent or an adult's confession, and then it gets taken advantage of by, certain elements. I'm not going to sit here and say a majority of those people, but even one is too many. And it's way more than one. Yeah. Right.
Absolutely.
And so I'm gonna call out the entire practice of it. And now I'm going to talk about how Scientology uses this because it fits right in with what I was just talking about.
Oh, please do, because I'm eager to hear, the earliest age that you audit kids or things like that. Because
8 or 9 years old is when Hubbard said you can start auditing kids. And
I wonder if he read Joseph Smith on that.
Yeah, and that's like holding the cans in an auditing room. As long as the child can understand the questions that are being asked, you can audit him, right?
And do these auditing sessions cover sexual themes, sexual subjects?
Well, yes, they do. Let me talk specifically about what are called in Scientology, what are called confessionals, also known as security checks. Okay. Same word is used to describe the exact same procedure. Hubbard just lifted confessional from Catholicism or Christianity because it has more of it has all that religious baggage connected with it, right?
Yeah, so we're more inclined to accept these things when they take on a sacred aura, and that's part of the sacred lexicon.
That's right. But the procedure is nothing short of an interrogation. And you're hooked up to this thing that you believe has the power of a lie detector, the E-meter, the electropsychometer. The confessionals are always done on the meter, holding those cans. Hubbard was very clear about the fact that you do not do a confessional or a security check the way it's done in a Catholic church, where a guy and a priest are sitting there talking, and it is more conversational. No. A security check is always a very formal procedure, right? And it always has to be done on the meter. And the reason why it has to be done on the meter is because Hubbard specifically said that you need to get the person to tell you everything. And if you
It's
don't,
like a lie detector, so you can
That's right.
tell when they're holding stuff back.
Well, it can, if the person who's holding the cans believes that that is what this device does, then they'll respond that way. And the meter will, the little needle on the meter will react because the person feels, nervousness, agitation, guilt over what is being asked of them. And so, and the meter responds plenty of times when there is nothing there at all, and yet it's still responding because of the nervous anxiety, anxiousness, that the person is feeling, because their body, the meter is reading the person's body. It's measuring electrical resistance. So, when the hormones are kicking in and the sweat's going and the person is nervous and they're having micro twitches of their hands that they're not even feeling, it's going to show up on that meter. The little needle's going to be bang, bang, bang on things. And so then you also get the additional problem in Scientology of having to confess on questions that you didn't even do anything wrong, but now you have to make up answers in order to satisfy the person you're confessing to, because the meter is saying, you've done something. Now, let me give you an example. Let's back up and I'll break this down. Anyone in Scientology is open to being security checked at any time at the whim of the church, or the people in the church who determine these things. And so it is done for investigatory purposes. Normally, in the normal course of a person progressing through Scientology services, their confessional sessions are noted as confidential, right? It's agreed that the person is in a confidential situation. They're confessing their sins. The only person who are supposed to know about it is the auditor, the person who's doing the confession, and the case supervisor, who's the person overseeing the progress of the person's case. And
that's given the same ecclesiastical exception and protection that any other pastoral relationship in other religions are, according to law. Is that correct?
In the United States, that is true.
Okay.
Yes, and the folders of the worksheets, because here's the other thing: is in a confessional, this is all written down, right? In a sec check, this is all written down. Everything the person is telling the auditor is noted down in detail. So those worksheets, the written worksheets of every single confessional or sec check, and I'm just going to start calling it a sec check, because it's to call it a confessional is just twisted. Yeah. So the sec check worksheets are kept in the folders of this person, and there's a stamp on every single one of those folders that says confidential priest penitent privileged file. So if the FBI were to come in and raid or something like that, they wouldn't have automatic okay to just start pouring through those files. That's one of the reasons why the church made those stamps and puts them on the folders. The problem is how the church uses those files, because we found in a court case where somebody was, Laura DiCrescenzo was suing to get her those folders back into her property, that 120 something people had access to her file. And so that's hardly what you would call a confidential, situation. Regardless of that, the sec checks themselves are very formalized procedures where the session is begun. There is a list. They're often it's not just off of the whim of the auditor as to what questions are going to be asked. They are always written out beforehand. Whether they are custom-made or what's called a tailor-made sec check for the person specifically sitting in front of you, or there are hundreds of pages of pre-made confessional forms or sec check forms in Scientology that cover different areas or spheres of activity or areas of responsibility. So you could go in for a, let's say. I have to finish one other point that I was making, which is this investigation thing. During the normal course of Scientology auditing, you will be sec checked as part of the steps that you take on the bridge to total freedom. And I've made videos about that. If anybody's curious about it, go look at those videos.
That's the carrot. The salvation.
That's right.
Mormonism, exaltation. That's what you want to get to, so you put up with all this other stuff because it's required to get there.
Exactly. So there is no such thing as a Scientologist who is not going to get sec checked. And you get sec checked often. and repeatedly. This happens all the time at various points on that bridge to total freedom. There's no getting around it. There's no way you're not going to get sect checked in Scientology.
Yeah, we have waypoint annual. You'll have an annual interview with the bishop, and anytime you move up to a different level of priesthood, then you have a worthiness interview to make sure that you're worthy enough to go there. So you're definitely getting it in Mormonism too.
Okay, good. And then you have situations come up where you might be suspected of having done something wrong, committed a crime, maybe done something against the church's rules or guidelines or something. Where they really think, or you have maybe even confessed to having done something in one area, and they think or suspect that maybe there's more to be found out in that area. Or maybe, for example, amongst the staff of a local city church, funds have gone missing, and they don't know who took them. So they're going to take everybody, and they're going to put them on the meter, and they're going to ask them sharp and pointed questions about whether they are embezzling funds from the local church. Because they don't know who did it, but they know somebody did it, right? So they're going to use a sect check to find out and narrow in on who they suspect might be the culprit. And then they're going to do what's called an investigatory, I'll call it an investigatory sect check. There's another term for it in Scientology, but that's what describes it. And that's not confidential. You know, going into one of those investigatory sect checks, that anything you say can and will be used against you afterwards, because you will be made to make amends for what you confess to, and you will be made to take responsibility for your crimes by, if you've embezzled money, you're going to be, looking forward to paying that money back, for example, and then taking steps to, get back into the trust of the church. And I don't know that those actions are wholly inappropriate if you're found, having engaged in criminal activities. But there's no confidentiality is my point.
Well, so, if laws have been broken, are they turning you over to legal authorities, or are they handling this all internally?
No, this would all be done internally.
We talk about financial stuff and their own legal system, that's one thing. But if they've transmuted that to sexual sins such as abuse, and if they say, oh, we're going to handle this internally, then that is a huge problem, because then, that's how cover-ups happen. That's the whole point of cover-ups.
And I was going to get to that, because I was going to lead this down to a current case that is a very hot topic right now, which is this guy Danny Masterson, who's a Scientology celebrity, and he was sect checked on the incidents of the accusations made against him of alleged sexual assault and rape, and I'm going to stress alleged, because it's not proven. And he might well be innocent of those charges. We don't know. And the LAPD has been investigating for a year, has not brought charges, has not dropped the investigation, so nobody really knows what the hell's going on. But Scientology knows, because he was sect checked on those incidents, right? And they're not about to share that information with law enforcement. So,
even under subpoena or anything like that?
That would be the sort of thing it would take, and it's never been tested in Scientology as far as I know.
Okay.
As far as case law goes. Now, getting back to the procedure of the sect check now, whether it's done as a regular course of the auditing or whether it's done in this investigatory way, the procedure is exactly the same. You go into a session, you have this pre-written list of questions, and the person is put on the meter, and then they are asked the questions. And it's not a matter of the person saying, yes, I did that, or no, I didn't. The person is asked, but the meter is what's being looked at to determine whether there is an answer to the question or not.
Oh my goodness. Okay. There's a total parallel to this in Mormonism.
Okay. I look forward to hearing about it, but let me go ahead and finish this description. So if the meter responds by the needle falling to the right on the in response to the question, let's say the auditor asks the person, have you ever stolen an apple? Okay, just there's an innocuous example of a question, but the questions that are asked are not innocuous at all. And they tend to be pretty precise, because Hubbard said that you want to ask very precise questions, very precisely worded questions, not broad questions. Have you ever done something wrong? that's never going to be a question that's asked, right?
No yes or no answers.
Yeah, no, it's going to be much more precise. Did you embezzle the funds from, the Treasury Department, or have you stolen something on your job, or in your relationship with your wife, have you ever cheated on her? Would be a much more narrowly focused question than have you ever committed adultery. You could ask, have you ever committed adultery? But it's a broad question, and what's preferred is the more specific, the better. So the person's not asked; the meter is asked, and so if the meter responds, then the auditor assumes that there is an answer that the person has thought of to that question, even if they only thought of it on a subconscious level, and now it's the job of the auditor, working with the person, the confessee, I guess I'll call him, to ferret out what the answer to the question might be.
Oh my God.
Right? And if the question...
This is a total setup for fabricated confessions.
Oh my God. Like you wouldn't believe. Now, if there is not a response, what they're looking for is a specific needle phenomena. The needle is supposed to do a motion like I'm making here. It's a back and forth rhythmic sweep of the dial at a slow, even pace of the needle, and that's called a floating needle. And if the needle is floating, then that tells the auditor that the guy is innocent of the question. There's nothing there, and the guy feels fine about it, and there's no nervousness or anxiousness connected to it, and it's all good. So what you want is that floating needle on the meter. You don't care, as the auditor, whether this guy is over there saying yes or no. So it goes both, this thing runs both ways. That guy could be sitting over there guilty as sin, saying yes in response to the question, but if the needle doesn't respond, the auditor's not going to take it up with him. Now, the auditor will ask the questions in different ways, because obviously, odds are, if the guy's over there saying, yes, I stole the money, whether the needle is responding or not, the auditor is going to go, okay, well, let's get down to this. And, but the auditor's not going to take it up until that meter responds somehow. Whether it responds to the auditor's question or the person saying, yes, I did, bang, the needle goes over, right? Or there are a whole series, this is kind of technical, but there's like a whole series of what are called buttons that can be asked to try to get the meter to respond. And there's like 20 of these. And the buttons go like this. Let's say the question is, have you ever stolen an apple? So there's no response, and the needle is not floating. So the auditor's sitting there going, okay, well, I gotta look more deeply into this because I don't know whether this guy has stolen an apple or not. So the next way he'll ask is he'll say, on the question, have you ever stolen an apple? Has anything been suppressed? And see if the needle responds. Well, and if it doesn't, he then checks another button. On the question, have you ever stolen an apple? Has anything been invalidated? And then there's a whole series of these buttons: suppressed, invalidated, misunderstood, not is, protested. I mean, there's a whole series of these things that are sort of, added to the question in order to try to get the meter to respond to the question, right? Like maybe the guy's sitting over there suppressing his thoughts. And so the idea of asking him the button question is to get him to, unsuppress his thoughts, right? On the question, have you ever stolen an apple? Has anything been suppressed? Oh, you got me. I was suppressing that thought, right? That's the idea with the buttons, right? Now, this is all predicated on this meter being an accurate and good lie detector, which it is not. But anyway, point is, you get a response on that meter, then you take up the question, and when you take up the question, you go into extreme detail on what was done. And so if you say, let's say, have you ever stolen an apple? And the guy says, okay, yeah, I stole an apple. Good. When was it? And these are pat questions. They're written down and they are remembered by the auditor like rotely. These are just rote questions that are asked. When was it? What did you do? Where was it? Of course, would be part of it. You want to get the time, place, form, and event. Okay, Hubbard?
No, I'm just, we're talking about an apple now, but I can just see how this could be used for any number of things really probe.
I'll give you some examples of some other questions that are used. But I'm just kind of using this question as a sort of a bland sort of example question, right? But you're going to get, no matter what the answer is and no matter what the subject matter is, you are always going to be asking these questions. What did you do? When was it? Where was it? Right? You want to get the entirety, all the details of it. And the auditor is free to ask as many sharp and pointed questions about what was done as he wants. So I had times when I was in a sec check and masturbation came up for an example, and it was, did you fantasize? What did you fantasize about? Did you use anything other than your hand? What did you use? You know, if it was in the shower, what did you do this? Did you do that? Like all kinds of details are being drawn out about exactly precisely what you did, to all the detail, all the grim and gory details. And then they ask, okay, is that all of that, right? Did you tell me everything about it, right? And once you get all the details of it, you are then asked, how did you justify that? In other words, how did you rationalize it to yourself? How did you make it okay with yourself to do that? You know, oh, well, you know, like let's say it's, stolen apple, right? Well, everybody eats apples, and apples are good, and I like apples, and I couldn't help myself, and blah, 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 blah. All the ways, all the thoughts the person had that rationalized for him or justified for him why he could do that thing, right? Get all that stripped off. Really and that really drives home the point. It takes all the excuses off, right? It was wrong. You were guilty of it. And any rationalization you had, yeah, forget all that, right? We're going to strip all that off of there. Then you ask, I mean, this really gets quite detailed. Then you ask, who missed it? And what that question means is, or a variation of that question is, did anyone do anything to make you wonder whether or not they knew? Okay, in other words, if somebody misses it, what that means is they made you wonder whether or not they knew that you had done that thing.
That's like deep psychological probing. I'm trying to piece together how this information would be used.
Well, again, it's a matter of Hubbard's theory of how to strip off, you know, these sins or these bad actions. In Scientology, the word for it is an overt or an overt act. That's what Hubbard called it.
Okay.
An overt act is any instance or activity of, harm to others or to yourself, or an action that is not the greatest good for the greatest number, right? So it's an overt act. And so you're asked, you know, who missed that overt? Who made you wonder whether or not they knew? And an answer might consist of something like, oh, yeah, my mother made me wonder because she said, wow, I thought I had an apple here and I can't find it. And it makes you, it's one of those moments where you go, "Doh," right? Oh, I think they know. I think they might know that I've done this thing. You're supposed to find all those times and tell the confessor, tell the auditor about it, right?
Is that used to know who to audit next?
No, it's just, although it could be. In an investigatory way, it could be. But it's mainly used because Hubbard said that it's those times when people miss it, when people make you wonder whether or not they know, those are the times that make you start hating those people. You start getting critical of them. You start like really, they start pissing you off, right? Is because they are missing your overt. They are making you wonder whether or not they know about what you did, and they're just messing with you, right? So he wants all that stripped off. That's just part of the procedure. And then this is the real fun part. If your needle is not floating after you've gotten off all the specifics of that one instance of you doing this thing, because you never talk about a whole series of incidents. You only talk about one precise time that you did whatever it is that you're being asked about. Not, oh, all through my childhood I stole apples all the time. That's not an acceptable answer. They want a very specific incident of you doing it. You get all the details about it, and if the needle's not floating, the next question is there an earlier similar time you stole an apple? And you then have to find
the whole thing again.
An earlier time, and you go through that entire process again. For that new earlier time when you were 7 years old and you stole the apple from the apple tree in, Farmer John's apple field, right? And you're going to go talk about that now, and you're going to get all the specifics of that. And this goes, and because Scientology believes in past lives and that you've lived a near infinite amount of time into the past, sect checks often go into past lives, right? Where you find earlier times where you have committed those sins or something similar to those sins, right? Maybe instead of, maybe it was 20 million years ago on planet Xerxes where you actually didn't just steal an apple, you stole the entire fruit supply for this population. And, they tend to get bigger as you go back because the imagination, and so what becomes a small thing in your imagination in Scientology, you're driven back to these earlier past lives where, the reason you're so concerned about it now, or the reason why it might seem like something that's really not a huge deal right now, is actually tied like an anchor to something you did millions of years ago that was unbelievably horrible. Right.
Do they believe that this process actually relieves guilt and anxiety? Because
Yes.
it sounds like it would just take a small thing and like multiply it logarithmically, like just over and over again.
No, the indoctrination procedure is that it is a good thing for you to be doing this procedure, because by getting off all of these details and specifics of what you've done, you are taking responsibility for your past bad deeds, and thereby becoming a better person who will not continue to repeat those deeds. Because Hubbard's theory is the reason why you are committing bad acts now is because of the accumulation of bad actions you've done in the past. So by relieving yourself of the guilt of those past bad actions, you free yourself now to not have to feel compelled or have a compulsion to do bad things and that sort of thing. Now, that is total horseshit. That does not work out at all in real life, but that's the theory that Hubbard uses to give Scientologists the incentive to confess their sins, and also the feeling that by doing so, they are becoming actually better and more powerful people. Because Hubbard says that when you commit sins, you commit these overts, they actually block your ability to perceive and act in the here and now, because all of your tension and guilt is tied up in these past incidents, right?
Do you guys have people in your former members who remember being in that believing, indoctrinated mindset and believing that they were being helped by these sessions? Maybe even testifying about how it really helped them. And then once they get out of it, looking back on it and realizing how psychologically destructive it was, and realizing that it was not helpful, it was hurtful, and finally being able to admit that. Like
you're talking to one right now. Yeah.
Oh, okay, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the most part, that is what happens with former members.
Same thing.
Yes.
Same thing. We look back and we're like, I can't believe that I felt like I had to subject myself to that process. And then you even get people who used to be those bishops who are like, I can't believe that I felt entitled to invade other people's lives like that. And they feel a lot of guilt on coming out over the actions they took on that. But the thing that really infuriates me now is, remember that mindset that I alluded to where you believe it's helping and everything. What we have now on this issue of these confessional interviews is when we're trying to describe how hurtful they are, how dangerous they are, the church is trotting out stories of people saying, oh, I went through this really tough time. I was struggling with sin, and the bishop really just helped me through, and I was able to, realign myself with the gospel and return to the fold. And so these success stories are being trotted out as proof that we shouldn't criticize this ecclesiastical ritual of confession.
Oh, Scientology would do exactly the same thing. And they wouldn't have to go any farther than looking in my folders. I wrote tons of success stories as a result of these confessionals, as well as all the other Scientology auditing I received, because I was in the mindset that this was a very positive good thing for me to be doing, and I was supposed to be relieved of my guilt. In fact, you're even a part of the procedure I didn't mention because we didn't get into it. At the end of the confessional, after you're asked, you know, these lists of questions, and you finally get a floating needle on every question on the list as you go, is the power of forgiveness step, where the auditor at the end of the confessional says, by the power invested in me by the Church of Scientology, I hereby forgive you for everything you have confessed in this confessional or in this sec check. Wow. And so the person, you know, and the person's supposed to feel such relief at the end of that, because now they've confessed all of their sins and thereby taken responsibility for what they did. And people have confessed some pretty gnarly shit in these sec checks because they get up to, I mean, I learned a lot about the things people get up to in their day-to-day life because I was somebody who administered these sec checks when I was in Scientology. Okay. And I did a program called the Rehabilitation Project Force, or the RPF, which is nothing but sec checks. I got over 1,000 hours of security checking, right? Across every aspect of my life. I mean, my entire life was roto-rooted under a microscope. It went across, you know, me not taking care of my body, not brushing my teeth, not eating right. I mean, all kinds of questions asked specifically about me in relation to me, to questions about my family, my wife, my past sexual activities, to my job, and a ton of questions about groups I've been part of and jobs I've held and bad things I did in those groups, to being asked questions about my species, about mankind, you know, and about animals and pets and, you know, torturing animals and things like that. I never did that, by the way. But, you know, those kinds of things are asked about, right?
See, the psychology of that, of this greater force or this institution feeling that they are entitled to have that type of intimate information about everybody in their group, but on top of that, the members of the group feeling that they owe it to the institution to have it, and then they disclose, they completely dissolve any boundary between their own private mental processes, their own individuality, and the group, gives that group such intense hold over them psychologically. So,
exactly.
You know, that was a powerful indoctrination technique.
That's right. That's what when I mentioned earlier that this whole confessional thing across all these religious groups is a method of control. This is what I'm talking about. Scientology takes it as a great example of how to take something like this to the ultimate extreme. Yes.
Yeah, I mean,
and that's why I wanted to talk about this, right?
It's just terrible.
Oh yeah, but I'm glad you brought that up, and you see exactly the point I wanted to make, which is that there is no such thing in Scientology as having a private life.
Yeah, absolutely.
It just doesn't exist. The entire concept is just out the window for Scientologists. If you're a member of the Church of Scientology, you kind of automatically, and it's an indoctrination process to get your head to this place, but you get to a place where you just don't have the right to keep anything from the church. And the way they sell that to you is they are only looking out for your best interests. Oh, yeah. They are only there to help you. And they are only doing this because it's for your spiritual salvation. But
it's funny
as we know, they will use this information. And this is just one thing. I mean, the procedure itself is psychologically damaging for all the reasons we've talked about. But on top of that, if you leave the church publicly, like I've done, or others have done, and you start talking smack about the church, they're going to pull out all those worksheets of all those, you know, thousands of hours of auditing and sec checking you've had, and they're going to cull through that information. They're going to take hours to cull through it all, and they're going to note down everything you did, and they're going to find blackmail material in there to shut you the hell up. Yeah. And they do that. We know they do that, right? So that is how that is used in an overt fashion against critics, But in this episode, when we're talking about this, I really want to stress how just the standard practice of Scientology all by itself is psychologically damaging, because
that's a whole level of coercion and control, where they're going to then, I mean, the whole point of ecclesiastical privilege is supposed to be that they don't share this with other people, but then knowing that anything that's in those files, because I know from the other things that even those ones stamped as, pastoral privilege or whatever, those get exploited in those ways to be weaponized.
Exactly.
The fact that the church can weaponize that at any point.
Yeah, the church doesn't care about that stamp.
Yeah,
the stamp is on the file to keep the FBI out of it, or anybody who's coming along and raiding the church. They don't want outsiders having privy to what they're finding out about their own parishioners. Yeah. What I'm saying right now, that nobody talks about this, right? This is not... Scientology will not be open and upfront with you about everything I'm telling you right now, right?
Yeah. The series The Path that was on Hulu, you can see echoes of that principle, where they've recorded those confessionals and then they can use them as blackmail material.
Right. That was just lifted right out of Scientology.
Yeah, I got that sense when I was watching it. Yeah. I'm like, I've heard Chris talk about this before.
Absolutely. And the additional factor, and this is an important one in Scientology specifically, and perhaps also occurs in other religions too, in an effort to satisfy the authority figure, is coming up with answers of things that you never even did. Right?
Yeah,
having to make up answers.
I don't know that happens in Mormonism, because we're not, the confession is for you to, all they have to do is demonize enough normal things, and they're going to get people that have to confess.
Yeah.
And so they don't have to then generate things. Which brings up a question so you talked a little bit about how they would do a confessional about masturbation. What is the teaching about sexual morality in Scientology that they could potentially ding you on? Like, is masturbation?
Masturbation's a big no-no. And it's funny how it has changed over the years. Actually, when I interviewed my mom, I actually talked about this with her, because she came up in Scientology in the 70s and left in the late 80s or early 90s. I was just coming into Scientology formally in the mid 1980s, and so when I was coming in, she was going out, and this is when David Miscavige was taking over the church, and he has this personal thing about sexual misbehavior, and so he's taken every bit of Hubbard's writings, which could be possibly construed to make things like masturbation be the ultimate sin, and he's taken those and said, yes, these are horrible, awful things that you do, and they seek to control your behavior through your sex life. And so basically anything where Hubbard kind of had a more relaxed view about it. I mean, my mom said nobody gave a crap about masturbation when she was, and she was a church ethics person. I mean, she was the one enforcing these rules. She definitely would have known. In the 1970s, it was like easy peasy, whatever. We don't really care about that, right? But come along to the 80s and the 90s, and masturbation's a sin. I mean, in the C organization, premarital sex or any sexual activity is an overt or is a sin, right? So, and you got a bunch of kids joining the C org in their teens, because that's their primary recruit pool. Right. And these people just can't wait to find a marital partner and shack up, and so they can finally have sex. And I mean, I got married within 3 months of arriving in the
we see that
org.
in Mormonism all the time. And when you do that, when you control premarital sex, and then you also control the gateway to marriage, it gives intense control over people, because there is this biological drive. So you've got these people who want to be good, but they also are subject to intense sexual frustration. And so now they've got to jump through whatever hoops in order to stay good with the community and get the right type of marriage, so that they can, fulfill that aspect of their existence. And it's a great control. We see, I'm a return missionary. I met a woman, and then 3 months later we were engaged, and 3 months after that we were married. And,
exactly.
We see that all the time. And then you get married really young. I was married when I was 19. Other people get married very young as a result of it.
That's right. Now, let me ask you a question. What's the divorce rate?
Yeah, well, that when you demonize divorce and you teach women that they have no voice and that they must be subject to their husbands, then you may have a divorce rate that's not terribly high, but you also have a high depression rate. You have a high
Yep.
abuse rate. You have all these things that normally would justify divorce get suppressed, and so you have a lot of unhealthy family dynamics that happen. And
I
Mormonism, the divorce rate is not different from the general population. We like to think that if you get married in the temple, it's this nice, holy, celestial thing, but it's really, you have same difficulties. And I think with those younger marriages, then there's probably a high, if not a higher rate of divorce, then certainly a higher rate of social markers that are not optimal, like depression or something like that.
Well, I'll bet you another one of those social markers, and I'm just shooting from the hip here, but I will bet you that the rate of adultery is probably fairly high too.
That may be.
It's just you're stuck in a marriage that's miserable. You don't like it. You can't get divorced because it violates church things, and so I'm just, like I said, I'm just shooting from the hip. In the Sea Org, which is where the premarital sex rule exists. It's not it's not a broad Scientology rule, and I hope nobody.
Oh, really? Okay.
No, it's not a broad Scientology rule. It is a Sea organization thing.
Wait, so you can't masturbate, but you can have premarital sex?
Yeah.
If you're a general member?
Yes. Yeah. Nobody's really particularly. Although, again, if you
do they teach that Oh, hold on. I'm sorry to interrupt, but do they teach that masturbation leads to homosexuality?
No.
Oh, okay. That was a staple Mormon teaching for a while.
No, nothing like that. No, Scientology is different than that. They got a lot of.
That was a very common religious idea in the 70s and 80s, and so it was not surprising to see that taught in Mormonism. And so I think we see that as a remnant idea, and I think the Jehovah's Witnesses have the same thing.
Sure.
And what about homosexuality in general? How is
No, that's a bad thing. That's a bad thing. I'm kind of losing. I got like 5 points. I'm in the middle of here.
Sorry, I keep
No, it's all good. I'm just trying to get my train of thought. The thing I wanted to talk about with the marriage thing first, just to finish that off entirely, is that in the Sea Org, you'll have couples divorce and a guy or a girl or whatever. I've seen people get married 5 times in the Sea organization. Because
5 times?
Yeah, I've seen people get married, divorced, 5 times. And this is not uncommon. This happens all the time in the Sea Org. That people are getting divorced and then they're looking for another partner because they only really married this person because they wanted to hook up with them. Not
we have
because,
this thing where you go down to Vegas, get married, hook up, get it annulled, then go back up to Salt Lake City.
Oh my God, why should I not be surprised by that? Of course you do. Of course you do. And it's all, literally within the laws of the church. Yeah, the Sea Org doesn't go that far, mainly because they don't have the time off to be able to do that.
Fair enough.
Anyway, it's definitely a rule in the Sea Org. Now, no, with masturbation, it's that you get a hairy palm. I'm just kidding. Okay. No, it's just a bad thing to do. You're supposed to exert self-discipline. You're supposed to control yourself because Hubbard says that masturbation is actually mentally harmful. That it makes a person pull in pictures of, from fantasizing of sex and sexually related activities, or they're watching porn, which is, another no-no. And so you're then, because you're sitting there thinking of this stuff and this stuff is coming up all the time, then you become kind of addicted to it. You become an addictive personality. Like these kinds of things are the results of masturbation, and that's why it's a bad thing. But again, this is actually taking some writings that Hubbard wrote where he said it really isn't that big of a deal, and Miscavige putting his Miscavige twist on it to make it the worst sin ever. Right. That's how it's happened in Scientology. It was not that way under Hubbard.
Yeah, we've seen evolution on teachings on masturbation in particular change over time in a similar way that you describe.
Yeah.
Before it gets much later, because I have to go in a little bit.
I know we're running way over time, so I did want to figure out how to wrap this up. We got 10,000 more things to talk about, but I think,
just the subject of masturbation alone and the effect of its demonization does a whole thing. But on the issue of the nature of these confessions, the harm that they have, the inordinate control that it has. I think seeing how it can be taken to its extreme in Scientology, I imagine you may have stories where that relationship has led to abuse. Even if it hasn't led to abuse, the psychological trauma it inflicts on the victims is significant. In Mormonism, we have a time right now where we can make as big a splash as possible to try to protect the younger generation that are going to grow up in this culture. And so what I'd like to ask is any of your viewers, anyone that sees this, take the time to find the petition. We'll put a link in the message. Click on it. And if you support the notion that we should have policies which protect against this type of damage, this type of abuse, this type of hurt, then add your name to it, even if it's anonymously, so that we can make as big of an impact as possible. This is the type of education that any group really needs to go through to make their group safer and to protect kids.
Big time, exactly. All right, good. Well, we're gonna have to wrap this up now. There's a lot more we could talk about, including the fact that not only are adults sect checking kids in Scientology, but kids actually sect check adults too.
Really?
Yeah, you'll have 15-year-olds who can learn how to do the auditing and the sect checking procedure. Never an 8-year-old, but right. I have seen with my own eyes 13 and 14-year-olds doing security checks on grown adults and having to ask them the questions on the forms, and sometimes those questions are of a sexually explicit nature. Wow, I have seen that. So
I mean, that brings to mind just the inappropriate sexual nature of that type of conversation, as well as the Orwellian theme of children being indoctrinated by the larger group to then report their parents or to report other adults. And we saw that in the book 1984. It's kind of a totalitarian theme.
Exactly. So,
well, thank you for inviting me to have this conversation, Chris. And, there may be other things that come up. This is a moving target. We're going to see how big this can go. And, maybe there'll be a chance to do an update in a little bit.
Absolutely. I'm sure that we are not done talking about this. Thanks a lot, Jonathan, for being on board. We're going to wrap up now. Like I said, we're way over time. So thank you very much, everybody who has stayed and watched and listened to this. And go ahead and give us a thumbs up, like and share this thing across the interwebs. And I will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.